The morning started just like any other for Daniel, the young grocery clerk who worked in a small but busy supermarket at the edge of town. He woke up before the sun had fully risen, washed his face with cold water, and slipped into the same neat uniform he wore every day. His life was simple and quiet, but he carried himself with a sense of responsibility that made people who noticed him respect him, even if most barely paid attention. To him, it was not just a job, it was a way to contribute, a way to make someone's day a little easier. Daniel did not have a car of his own. He walked to work each morning, carrying a small backpack with a sandwich and a bottle of water packed the night before. The streets were still cool from the night air, and he often enjoyed the calm silence before the city grew noisy. He would wave to the elderly man who always sat on his porch with a cup of tea, and he would nod at the newspaper boy who hurried past on his bicycle. These little exchanges meant something to Daniel, even though most people never thought about them again. They reminded him that kindness, no matter how small, made the world feel a little lighter. At the supermarket, the day began with the usual rush. Customers trickled in, some cheerful, some hurried, and some lost in their own worries. Daniel stood at the checkout counter for a while, scanning groceries with steady hands and offering a polite smile to everyone who came his way. He had mastered the art of being quick yet careful, making sure each item was handled with care. When elderly customers struggled with heavy bags, he would step around the counter and carry them to their cars without waiting to be asked. If a mother had a restless child tugging at her sleeve, he would hand the little one a free balloon from the corner basket just to see them smile. He was not the type of person who sought recognition. In fact, most people forgot his face soon after leaving the store. To them, he was simply the clerk, a background character in their daily errands. But Daniel never minded that. He found quiet satisfaction in doing his job well, in being dependable. Life had not given him riches, but it had given him a sense of purpose in small acts of service. As the morning wore on, he was assigned to cart duty outside. This meant collecting the shopping carts scattered across the parking lot and returning them in neat rows near the entrance. It was not the most glamorous task, but Daniel did it diligently, weaving through the rows of parked cars, sometimes exchanging a wave with customers loading groceries into their trunks. The sun had climbed higher by now, and the lot was growing warmer with each passing minute. He moved steadily, pushing a long line of carts back toward the entrance, the squeak of the wheels echoing against the pavement. It was physical work, and sometimes tiring, but he didn't complain. He used the time to clear his head, to think about his family, his dreams, and even the little things, like how he hoped to save enough money someday for a second-hand car so his walks to work would not be so long. Inside the store, the manager noticed how Daniel worked without needing to be told twice. He wasn't flashy or loud like some employees, but he was reliable. Customers occasionally left small compliments at the service desk about the polite young man who helped with my bags or the kind clerk who found my lost wallet. Those words rarely reached Daniel directly, but they stayed on his manager's notes. Still, Daniel never worked for praise. His nature was humble, and he believed that goodness should be practiced quietly. That day, as the parking lot filled up with more cars, he kept at his task, sweat glistening on his forehead. He took a short pause, leaning against the handle of a cart for a moment, watching the ordinary life around him. Families came and went, children laughed, someone honked in impatience, and a couple argued softly over which bags went where in the trunk. It was a scene he had witnessed countless times, yet each day had its own rhythm. To him, it was a reminder of the small stories unfolding all around, stories he might never know but still felt connected to. Daniel's own story was quiet. He lived with his mother in a modest apartment on the other side of town. His father had passed away years earlier, and since then, Daniel had felt the weight of responsibility to help his mother as much as he could. She often reminded him that even though their life wasn't filled with luxuries, they had each other, and that was enough. These words stayed with him, shaping his attitude toward life. His friends, the few he had, sometimes teased him for working so hard for so little. They chased other ambitions, but Daniel kept his head down. He had bigger dreams too, though he never spoke of them often. He hoped to one day study further, maybe business or accounting, so he could move forward in life. But until then, he chose to be faithful in the present moment. The parking lot buzzed with activity as more customers arrived. Daniel maneuvered between cars, retrieving stray carts, smiling politely when someone thanked him for moving one out of the way. Some people barely noticed him at all, too caught up in their phones or conversations. He didn't take offense. He had learned that kindness wasn't about being seen, it was about being genuine. The day stretched on, and though his shift wasn't over yet, Daniel already felt the familiar tiredness settling into his muscles. Still, he pressed forward with steady determination. To him, finishing a task properly mattered more than comfort. As he wheeled another line of carts back to the store, a soft breeze blew across the lot, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter from a child somewhere nearby. It made him smile to himself, unaware that in just a short while, his life would take an unexpected turn because of a similar sound. At that moment, nothing seemed unusual. The cars gleamed under the sun, the asphalt radiated heat, and the world carried on in its ordinary rush. Daniel could never have guessed that this simple day, starting as quietly as all the others, would soon test his courage in a way he had never imagined. The afternoon sun was now higher in the sky, and the parking lot had become busier than usual. Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and continued pushing another line of carts toward the store entrance. The rhythmic squeak of the wheels filled the air as he guided them carefully between parked cars. His mind drifted for a moment, thinking about the sandwich in his backpack that he planned to eat during his short break. As he worked, he noticed the usual things people often overlooked. A child tugged on his mother's dress, asking for candy. An older man struggled with bags that seemed heavier than his arms could handle. A couple debated over receipts, trying to figure out if they had been charged too much. These were ordinary sights, part of the everyday flow of life in the supermarket lot. But suddenly, among the ordinary, something unusual caught Daniel's attention. At first, he thought he heard a faint sound, a small cry, soft but clear enough to rise above the hum of voices and car engines. He paused, frowning slightly, trying to locate where it was coming from. The sound was sharp, urgent, the unmistakable cry of a baby. His eyes scanned the rows of cars, searching for the source. Then he saw it. A stroller, carrying a baby no more than a year old, was slowly rolling away from a parked car. It must have slipped from the mother's grasp as she busied herself loading groceries into the trunk. At first, the movement was slow, almost unnoticeable, but the stroller had wheels, and the parking lot was slightly slanted. Gravity was pulling it farther and farther away. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he realized the danger. Just a few meters ahead, cars were passing through the main lane of the lot, drivers distracted as they looked for parking spots. If the stroller kept rolling, it would enter that lane within seconds. For a brief moment, it felt as if time had slowed. Daniel dropped the handle of the carts he was pushing and ran. He did not stop to think, did not pause to wonder if anyone else would act. He simply moved, his legs carrying him as fast as they could. His shoes slapped against the pavement, his chest tightened, and the sound of his own breathing grew louder. All the while, the stroller continued its path, inching dangerously closer to the open lane. The baby's cries grew louder now, drawing the attention of a few nearby shoppers. A woman gasped and pointed, but she was too far away to do anything. The mother of the child turned around just in time to see the stroller leaving her reach. Her hands flew to her mouth, panic spreading across her face, but her arms were full of grocery bags, and she stumbled in shock. Fear rooted her in place. Daniel focused only on the stroller. The sight of the small child inside, helpless and unaware of the danger, fueled his speed. Every second mattered. His feet pounded against the ground, his arms pumping as he closed the gap. He could hear the faint roar of a car engine turning into the lot. There was no time to waste. Just as the stroller's front wheels edged closer to the painted line of the lane, Daniel lunged forward. His hands reached out, his body stretching as far as it could. With a swift and desperate motion, he grabbed the handle of the stroller and pulled it back with all his strength. The stroller jerked to a stop, rocking slightly, but it was safe. The baby inside wailed loudly, little arms flailing, but unharmed. Daniel's chest heaved as he steadied the stroller, his knees trembling slightly from the sudden burst of energy. Relief washed over him like a wave. He bent down, speaking softly to the baby in a calm voice, trying to soothe the cries. "It's all right, little one. You're safe now." His words were gentle, carrying the warmth of someone who cared deeply, even though the child was a stranger to him. The mother rushed forward, dropping a bag of groceries in her haste, items spilling across the pavement. She reached the stroller, her eyes wide with tears, her hands shaking as she touched her baby's face. She pulled the stroller close and clutched the handle tightly, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Oh my goodness, oh no, thank you, thank you." Daniel straightened, brushing the dust from his uniform, his face slightly flushed. "It's all right, ma'am," he said simply, offering a small smile. "I just happened to be close enough." The mother's gratitude poured out in hurried words. "I didn't see it. I thought the brake was on." I could have lost. Her voice cracked, and she could not finish the sentence. She looked at Daniel with eyes full of relief and disbelief, as if trying to understand how a stranger had appeared at just the right moment. Shoppers nearby had also witnessed the scene. A few clapped lightly, others murmured words of amazement. One man shook his head and said, "That was close. You saved that baby, young man." Another woman added, "Not everyone would have acted that fast. You did something good." Daniel felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. He was not used to being in the center of a crowd. He nodded politely, his humble smile never fading, and took a step back to give the mother space with her child. Inside, however, his heart was still racing from the rush of adrenaline. The weight of what had almost happened began to sink in, and he realized how quickly life could change in the blink of an eye. The mother bent down to pick up her spilled groceries, but Daniel quickly moved to help. He gathered the fallen items and placed them carefully back into her bags. She thanked him again, her voice still trembling, and looked at him as though words could never fully express what she felt. "I'll never forget this," she whispered, holding her baby close. Daniel shook his head softly. "I'm just glad I was here," he replied. And he meant it. To him, it was not about being remembered, it was about the simple truth that a child was safe because he had been in the right place at the right time. As the small crowd began to disperse, life in the parking lot slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Cars continued to come and go, shoppers carried their bags, and the hum of everyday life resumed. Yet, for those who had seen what happened, the image of the young clerk running across the lot to stop a runaway stroller stayed fresh in their minds. It was a reminder that sometimes, heroes looked nothing like what people expected. Sometimes, they wore simple uniforms and worked quietly in the background. Daniel returned to his line of carts, pushing them toward the store once again. His heart was calmer now, though the moment replayed in his mind like a vivid picture. He did not think of himself as brave or heroic. He thought only of the baby's wide eyes and the mother's trembling hands, and how close it had all been. To him, that was enough. What Daniel did not know, what no one mentioned to him at that moment, was that a pair of eyes had been watching the entire scene from behind the tinted window of a black limousine parked just a short distance away. Someone had witnessed everything: the running, the rescue, the humility afterward. And that someone was not just another passerby. It was the father of the very child he had saved. But Daniel, still unaware, continued with his day as though nothing extraordinary had happened, never guessing that the simple act of rushing toward danger for the sake of a child would soon change the course of his life in ways he could not imagine. The stroller stood steady now, safely back in the mother's hands, but Daniel's heart was still beating faster than usual. He took a deep breath and tried to steady himself, brushing his palms on his uniform as if shaking off the moment. The small crowd that had gathered was already beginning to drift away, returning to their errands, but the echoes of what had almost happened remained in the air. The mother, still shaken, hugged her baby tightly and kissed the little one's forehead again and again. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the straps of the stroller, double-checking that everything was secure. She looked at Daniel with eyes full of emotion, her voice breaking when she said, "You don't know what you just did for me. I can't thank you enough." Daniel smiled gently, his tone calm and steady. "I just did what anyone should do. I'm glad your baby is all right." But deep inside, he knew not everyone would have reacted the way he did. It had taken quick thinking and faster action. He had not even thought about his own safety when running across the lot. His only focus had been on the stroller and the child inside it. That realization made him pause for a moment, though he kept his modest expression. The mother continued speaking, her voice rising slightly as if she wanted others to hear her gratitude. "You were like an angel sent at the right time. I can't imagine what could have happened." Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she wiped them quickly with the back of her hand. Daniel, uncomfortable with too much praise, quickly bent down to gather the last of the fallen groceries. A can of soup had rolled under the car, and he reached for it, placing it back in the bag carefully. The mother tried to take the bag from him, but he insisted on carrying it to her trunk. "Let me help you," he said softly. "You've had enough of a scare already." She allowed him, watching him with gratitude as he lifted the bags and arranged them neatly inside. When he was finished, he closed the trunk gently and gave her another polite smile. "Take care of your little one," he said. The baby, though still sniffling from the earlier fright, had calmed a little. The child looked at Daniel with wide eyes, as if sensing the kindness in him. For a brief second, the baby even smiled, a tiny expression that made Daniel's own lips curve upward. "Thank you," the mother said again, almost whispering this time. Her voice was softer, less panicked now but more heartfelt. Daniel nodded. "It's nothing, really. I'm just glad everything is fine now." And with that, he stepped back, ready to return to his carts. But the scene had not gone unnoticed. A few people who had seen the whole thing were still talking about it as they walked away. Words like "quick thinking," "brave young man," and "saved that child" floated in the air. Daniel overheard them but didn't let them sink in. He wasn't used to being called brave. To him, bravery was something grand, like firefighters running into burning buildings or doctors saving lives in hospitals. What he had done felt simple. It was instinct, not heroism. Still, as he walked back toward the row of carts he had abandoned, he could feel the adrenaline slowly leaving his body. His legs felt a little heavy now, and his breath was still uneven. It was as though his body was only now realizing what had happened. He leaned for a second against the carts, steadying himself, and let out a long sigh. The mother wheeled her stroller away, glancing back one more time at him before disappearing into the crowd. Daniel stood quietly, watching her go, before turning back to his work. Life in the parking lot resumed its normal rhythm, but for him, the ordinary had been interrupted in a way that left a lasting mark. He began collecting carts again, pushing them toward the entrance. Some customers smiled at him as they passed, perhaps recognizing him from the incident, but Daniel only nodded politely in return. He did not crave attention. In fact, he hoped people would soon forget what had happened so he could go back to being invisible, just a clerk doing his job. But inside his mind, the image of the stroller rolling away replayed over and over. Each time, he imagined what might have happened if he had not been there, If he had been just a little slower, if a car had arrived at the wrong moment. The thought made his chest tighten. He shook his head slightly, trying to push away those dark possibilities. He reminded himself that the baby was safe, and that was all that mattered. As he worked, a man who had witnessed the rescue approached him. He was older, with gray hair and kind eyes. "Young man," the stranger said, "I saw what you did back there. Not everyone would have acted so fast. You should be proud." Daniel gave a small smile, his voice quiet. "Thank you, sir, but I just did what anyone would have done." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Don't sell yourself short. Most people freeze in moments like that. You didn't." With that, he patted Daniel's shoulder and walked away. The words stayed with Daniel longer than he expected. He continued pushing carts, his thoughts turning over the man's statement. Was it really true that most people wouldn't have acted? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he hadn't thought twice, he had only seen a child in danger. By now, the sun was beginning to lower slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across the parking lot. The heat of the day was still heavy, but Daniel barely noticed it. His mind was still caught between relief and reflection. As the minutes turned into an hour, the incident slowly faded from the lot. New shoppers came, unaware of what had happened earlier. Cars moved in and out, carts filled and emptied, and Daniel's work carried on as though nothing unusual had taken place. But deep inside, he knew the moment would stay with him. It wasn't just another task completed, it was a reminder of how fragile life could be, and how a single choice in a single second could make all the difference. Daniel finally allowed himself a short break. He sat on the bench near the entrance, sipping water from his bottle and unwrapping his sandwich. As he ate, he thought of his mother back home. He wondered what she would say if she knew about the incident. She would probably call him her brave boy, though he would insist he wasn't brave at all. He imagined telling her about it at dinner, and how she might shake her head, half worried and half proud. He smiled to himself at the thought, then finished his meal and stood up again, ready to return to work. To everyone else, he was just a clerk doing his duty. But unknown to him, hidden behind the tinted glass of a sleek black limousine parked quietly at the edge of the lot, someone had seen everything. Someone who mattered more than he could imagine. The man inside the limousine had witnessed the moment from start to finish: the rolling stroller, the mother's panic, the young clerk's dash across the pavement, and the final rescue. He had seen the humility in the boy's face afterward, the way he brushed off the praise as if it were nothing. And this man, watching silently, was not just any bystander. He was the father of the very child who had been saved. But Daniel, unaware of those eyes upon him, continued with his work, his day returning to its usual rhythm. For him, it was enough that the baby was safe. He had no idea that his simple act of courage had planted the first seed of something far greater, something that would soon unfold in ways he could not yet imagine. The limousine stood quietly at the far end of the parking lot, its polished black surface reflecting the sunlight. Most people passing by did not pay it much attention. They were too focused on their shopping bags, their children, or finding an empty parking space. But inside the car, behind tinted windows, sat a man who had seen everything that had just unfolded. His eyes had been fixed on the young grocery clerk from the very moment the stroller had started rolling. The man was tall, with sharp features that carried both authority and calmness. He was dressed in a fine suit, his tie neatly knotted, his shoes shining. The air inside the limousine smelled faintly of leather and cologne, a world far different from the hot asphalt outside. His name was Richard, a successful businessman who was known in the city for his wealth and influence. Yet at that moment, none of his achievements, none of his status, mattered more than what he had just witnessed. His wife and baby had arrived at the supermarket earlier, and he had followed quietly in his car. He had been away on a business trip for several days and wanted to surprise them. He had planned to step out once she finished shopping, to greet them both with open arms. But before he could, he saw the terrifying moment when the stroller began to drift away from her. His heart had nearly stopped as he watched it roll toward the lane. From inside the limousine, Richard's body tensed, his hand gripping the door handle, ready to jump out. But before he could move, a blur of motion caught his eye: the young clerk, running with every ounce of strength in his body. He saw the determination in the boy's stride, the way his arms reached out desperately, the moment he grabbed the stroller just before it crossed into danger. Richard's breath left him in a rush of relief. His child was safe. But it wasn't just the rescue that struck Richard. It was what came afterward. He watched closely as the mother clutched the stroller, tears in her eyes, and the young man stood quietly, humbly brushing it all off as if it were nothing. Richard saw the boy bend down to pick up spilled groceries, saw him arrange them neatly in the trunk, saw him smile softly when the baby looked up at him. There was no arrogance, no expectation of reward, only sincerity. For a long moment, Richard sat in silence, his thoughts deep and heavy. He had met countless people in his life: businessmen, leaders, professionals, but rarely had he seen such pure instinct for kindness. Most people would have frozen. Some might have shouted for help. Few would have risked themselves the way this young man had. The driver of the limousine, a middle-aged man named Samuel, glanced at him through the mirror. "Sir, is everything all right?" he asked politely. Richard leaned back, his eyes still fixed on the clerk outside. "Everything is more than all right," he murmured, almost to himself. Then he added, "Did you see him? That young man?" Samuel followed his gaze. "Yes, sir. I did." He acted quickly. "Brave, if I may say." Richard nodded slowly. "Brave, and humble. That's rare." He continued to watch as the clerk returned to his line of carts, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Richard's chest tightened with emotion. That was his child, the most precious part of his life, and a stranger had just saved him without hesitation. He thought about his own life for a moment. His wealth had given him comfort, power, and recognition. Yet all the money in the world could not have stopped that stroller in time. It was not wealth that saved his child. It was the quick heart of a grocery clerk in a plain uniform. That realization humbled him more than he expected. As minutes passed, Richard remained in the limousine, lost in thought. His wife, unaware of his presence, had already left the lot with the baby. She assumed she would meet her husband later at home, not knowing he had been there all along. Richard did not follow her immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes on Daniel, watching the way he worked with quiet dedication. The boy pushed carts with care, greeted customers with a polite nod, and carried on as though he had not just prevented a tragedy. Richard admired that. In his world, people often boasted of their smallest achievements, seeking attention and praise. Yet here was someone who had done something extraordinary and then quietly returned to his duties. That kind of character, Richard thought, was priceless. "Samuel," Richard said softly, "find out about that young man. I want to know his name, his story." The driver hesitated. "Sir, do you mean the clerk?" "Yes," Richard replied firmly, his tone calm but resolute. "The clerk." Samuel nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll see what I can do." For the rest of the afternoon, Richard sat back in his seat, still reflecting on what had happened. His eyes occasionally drifted back to Daniel, and with each glance, his respect grew. He thought about how easily his family could have suffered a devastating loss. He thought about the look on his wife's face when she realized the danger, about the sound of his baby's cry, and about the young man who had brought both back to safety. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold, the parking lot began to quiet down. The rush of shoppers slowed, and the air grew calmer. Daniel continued working, his silhouette outlined against the warm light. He didn't know it, but every move he made was being watched closely. Inside the limousine, Richard made a silent promise to himself. This young man would not be forgotten. His act of courage deserved more than passing praise. He deserved an opportunity, a reward not for the sake of gratitude alone, but because Richard believed the world needed more people like him in positions where they could shine. At that moment, Richard decided that his connection with Daniel would not end in the parking lot. The rescue of the baby had tied their lives together in a way that could not be undone. And though Daniel had no idea, his life was about to change. The limousine finally pulled away slowly, blending into the evening traffic. Daniel, still collecting carts, never noticed it leaving. To him, the day was winding down, just another shift nearing its end. He was tired, yes, but also quietly content that he had been able to prevent something terrible. That was enough for him. But while he returned home later that night, thinking the day was finished, Richard was making plans. Plans that would soon bring the two of them face to face, not as a clerk and a stranger, but as two men connected by a single extraordinary moment. And so, without knowing it, Daniel's ordinary life was moving towards something unexpected. The simple act of saving a child in a supermarket parking lot had placed him under the watchful eye of someone who had the power to change everything. That night, Daniel returned home later than usual. His shoes were dusty, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and his body felt heavier than it had in the morning. But when he entered the small apartment he shared with his mother, he was greeted by the familiar warmth that always comforted him. The smell of cooked rice filled the air, and his mother smiled when she saw him. "You're late, Daniel," she said softly, handing him a plate of food. "Work was busy," he replied, sitting down at the worn wooden table. He didn't tell her about the stroller, about the baby, or about the crowd in the parking lot. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because it still felt unreal, like something that had passed quickly and was better left in silence. He didn't want to worry her either. For him, the day was done, and tomorrow would bring another shift just like always. But across town, in a large house with shining lights and tall gates, Richard sat with his wife, holding their baby in his arms. He had told her everything, from the moment he saw the stroller begin to roll to the second Daniel caught it and brought it back to safety. His wife listened with tears in her eyes, clutching his hand. "That young man saved our child," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We owe him everything." Richard nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. "Yes. And I intend to find him." The next day at the supermarket, Daniel returned to his routine. The morning was ordinary again, filled with customers and carts, the beep of scanners, and the buzz of conversations. He carried on as though nothing unusual had ever happened. But by midday, something unexpected occurred. The store manager, Mr. Blake, called Daniel into his small office. "Daniel," he said, adjusting his glasses, "someone has been asking about you." Daniel frowned, surprised. "Asking about me? Why?" The manager smiled faintly, almost amused. "A well-dressed man came in this morning. Said he wanted to know about the young clerk who works hard and helped a mother yesterday in the parking lot. I believe he meant you." Daniel's face grew warm. He had not expected the incident to spread beyond that moment. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I didn't do anything special, sir. Just reacted." The manager leaned forward. "Not everyone reacts like that. People have been talking. You might not think it was special, but others do. And from the way this man asked about you, I think he believes the same." Daniel didn't know what to say. He nodded politely, then returned to his duties, though his thoughts kept circling around the mystery of the visitor. Later that evening, as his shift was ending, he stepped out of the supermarket doors and into the cool air of the parking lot. He was tired, but his walk home was still ahead of him. He had barely taken 10 steps when he noticed a black limousine parked near the entrance. At first, he thought it was coincidence, another wealthy customer passing by. But then the rear door opened, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out. It was Richard. He walked toward Daniel with calm, steady steps. There was something commanding about his presence, yet his eyes were warm, carrying the weight of gratitude. Daniel stopped in his tracks, unsure of what was happening. "You're Daniel, aren't you?" Richard asked, his voice firm but kind. "Yes, sir," Daniel answered cautiously. Richard extended his hand. "My name is Richard. Yesterday, you saved my child's life." The words hit Daniel with a force he wasn't prepared for. He blinked in surprise, shaking his head slightly. I I didn't know. I only acted because you have a good heart," Richard interrupted gently. "I was there. I saw everything. You didn't hesitate, you didn't wait for someone else, you just ran. That kind of courage is rare." Daniel lowered his gaze, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone should do, sir." Richard studied him for a moment, recognizing the humility that had struck him the day before. "Perhaps. But you did it. And I want to thank you not just with words, but with something more." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "That's not necessary. I don't expect anything." "I know you don't," Richard said, his tone softening. "That's exactly why you deserve it." He gestured toward the limousine. "Come with me. Just for a few minutes. I'd like to talk." Hesitant but curious, Daniel followed him. The driver opened the door, and Daniel stepped into the car. The inside was unlike anything he had ever experienced: soft leather seats, cool air, polished surfaces. He sat nervously, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Richard sat across from him, his eyes steady. "Tell me about yourself, Daniel. Where do you live? Do you study? What do you want for your future?" At first, Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to being asked such questions by strangers, especially someone of Richard's stature. But gradually, he spoke. He told him about his mother, about the small apartment, about walking to work each day. He admitted he had dreams of studying further, of building a better life, but money had always been the obstacle. Richard listened quietly, nodding as Daniel spoke. When the young man finished, Richard leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, yesterday you gave me something I can never repay. You gave me my child's life. But today, I can give you something in return. An opportunity." Daniel looked at him, puzzled. "Opportunity?" "Yes," Richard replied. "I run a company. We need people like you, honest, quick-thinking, dependable. I want to offer you a position. Not just a job, but a chance to grow. I'll cover your education too, if you're willing to study. You don't need to struggle alone anymore." The words left Daniel speechless. His heart pounded, his thoughts racing. It sounded too good to be true. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I don't even know if I deserve this." Richard smiled gently. "You do. Yesterday proved that. You didn't think of yourself, you thought of someone else. That's the kind of person I want beside me. And that's the kind of person the world needs." Silence filled the car for a moment as Daniel tried to absorb what he was hearing. A simple grocery clerk, who just yesterday was pushing carts in the heat, was now being offered a path toward a brighter future. He thought of his mother, of the sacrifices she had made, of the quiet prayers she whispered each night. Maybe this was the answer to those prayers. With a shaky breath, Daniel finally nodded. "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best." Richard extended his hand again, this time not just in gratitude, but in partnership. Daniel shook it, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his heart. That night, When Daniel returned home, he told his mother everything. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged him tightly, whispering words of pride and relief. For her, the world had always been heavy with worries, but now, for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. The days that followed brought change. Daniel began working closely with Richard, learning skills, attending training, and preparing to start his studies. Life was no longer about just surviving each day, it was about building something for the future. Yet through it all, Daniel never let go of the humility that defined him. He continued to greet everyone with kindness, to help without being asked, to live with the same quiet heart that had led him to act in the parking lot that day. And Richard, each time he looked at his child, was reminded of the young man who had changed everything. He often thought about how fate had brought them together in such an unexpected way. A simple grocery clerk, with nothing but honesty and instinct, had become more than just a stranger, he had become family in spirit. Life moved forward, but the memory of that afternoon remained forever vivid. The stroller, the cries, the rush, the rescue, all of it had been a turning point. For Daniel, it was the moment that lifted him from the shadows of an ordinary life into a future filled with promise. For Richard, it was the moment he realized that true wealth was not in money, but in people with hearts that shone with quiet courage. And so, what began as a simple day in a supermarket parking lot ended as the beginning of a new story, one where lives were forever changed by a single act of selfless bravery.